Happy Monday, boys and girls. Today, before I start reading, I just wanted to say I hope everybody had a great weekend, and I want to encourage you to keep reading at home. Maybe try a math boxes if you have time for that, or maybe Unit 5, Week 4, you can do a discussion at home with somebody, or perhaps work on your vocabulary page. Just ideas of things that you can do. Be practicing your Dirty 30 if you get feeling rusty on that, but just some things to do that you might want to try this week. Okay, I do have my book here and my glasses are with me, and guess what I brought today, boys and girls? I have my box of Kleenex. I'm not quite sure how far into it we are, but I have a feeling this is coming. Yeah, okay. So, what's going on in our story, boys and girls? I think we left off where Billy the two dogs had won the cup, and they had just gotten home, and remember Grandpa was recuperating with a very, very badly sprained ankle, and Ma and Pa were talking about Billy, and he wasn't quite sure, maybe to help Grandpa with his store. I think that's where we kind of left off the last time. So this is chapter 19. Although the winning cups and the money was a big event in my life, it didn't change my hunting none. I was out after them ringtails every night. I had been hunting the river bottoms hard for about 3 weeks on that night. I decided to go back to the Silcone timber country. I had barely reached the hunting ground. My dog struck a trail, and old Dan opened up first. This struck the trail on a ridge and then dropped down into a deep canyon up the other side and broke into some flats. I could tell that the scent was hot from their steady bawling, and 3 times they treed that animal. Every time I came close to the tree, the animal would jump and the race would be on. After a while, I knew it weren't no coon. I decided maybe it was a bobcat. Every time I came close to that tree, the animal would jump and the race would be on again. After a while, I knew it wasn't a coon. I decided it was definitely a bobcat. I didn't like to have my dogs tree no big cats, for their fur weren't no good, and all I could accept was maybe 2 cut-up hounds. They could kill the largest bobcat in the hills and had on several occasions, but to me, that was kind of useless. The only good I could see in killing one of them was getting rid of a vicious, predatory animal. The 4th time they treed, they was on top of a mountain, and after that long chase, I figured that animal was winded and would stay in that tree, and in a trot, I started toward him. As I neared the tree, little Ann came to me and reared up and whined. By her actions, I knew something was wrong, and I stopped. In the moonlight, I could see old Dan sitting down on his haunches, staring up at that tree and bawling. The tree had lots of dead leaves on it, and I knew it was a large white oak, because it was one of the last trees in the mountains to lose its leaves. Old Dan kept a bawling, and then he did something he'd never done before. For seconds, his deep voice was still, and silence settled over the mountaintops. My eyes wandered from the tree to him, and his lips was curled back, and he snarled as he stared into that dark foliage of that tree. His teeth gleamed white in the moonlight, and the hair on his neck and along his back stood on end. A low, deep rumbling growl rolled out of his throat. I was scared, and I called to him. I wanted to get away from there, and again I called, but ain't no use. He wouldn't leave that tree, for in his veins flowed the breeded blood of a true hunting hound. In his fighting heart, there weren't no fear. I set the lantern down and tightened my grip on the handle of my axe, and slowly I started walking toward him. And I thought, if I can get close enough to him, I can grab his collar. I kept my eyes on the tree as I edged forward, and little Ann stayed right by my side. She, too, was watching that tree. Then I saw him, 2 burning yellow eyes staring at me from the shadowy foliage of that tree, and I stopped, petrified with fear. The deep baying of old Dan stopped, and again the silence closed in. I stared back at those unblinking eyes. I could make out the bulk of a real large animal crouched on a huge branch close to the trunk of that big old tree, and then it moved. I heard that scratch of razor-sharp claws on the bark, and it stood up and moved out of the shadows onto the edge of that limb, and I saw it clearly as it passed between the moon and me. I knew what it was then. It was the devil cat of those Ozarks. It was a mountain lion. The silence was shattered by one long, loud bawl from old Dan. I ain't never heard my dog bawl like that before. It was different. His voice rang out of the mountains loud and clear, and that vibration of the deep tones rolled in the silence of that frosty night. On and out over the flats, I heard it cry like the cry of a lost soul. Old Dan had voiced his challenge to that cat. There was a low cough and a deep growl from that line, and I saw him crouch, and I knew what was coming. I knew. My hands felt hot and sweaty on the smooth ash handle of my axe, and with a blood-curdling scream, he sprang from that tree with claws outspread and long yellow fangs bared. Old Dan didn't wait. Rearing up on his hind legs, he met the lion in the air, and the heavy weight bowled him over and over. He wound up in a fallen treetop. The impact of the two bodies threw that lion off balance, and little Ann darted in. Her aim was true. I heard the snap of her steel-trapped jaws as they closed in on his throat. With a squall of pain and rage, that cat rolled over on his side, dragging little Ann with him. His right paw reached out and curved over her shoulder. Sinews tightened and razor-sharp claws dug inward. With a cry of pain, she loosened her hold. I saw the blood squirting from that deep wound in her shoulder. She ignored it and bored back into that fight. And old Dan, stunned for an instant from the impact of that lion's body, fought his way from that treetop. Ball in the cray of that, he sunk in and charged right back. I went berserk and charged into that fight. There in the flinty hills of the Ozarks, I fought for the lives of my dogs. I fought with the only weapon I had, and that sharp cutting blade of my double-bladed axe. Screaming like a madman with tears running down my face, I hacked and I chopped at that big snarling mountain cat. Once, feeling the bite of that sharp blade, that devil cat turned on me, and his yellow-slitted eyes burned with hate. The long, lithe body deep low in the ground, and the shoulder muscles knotted and bulged, and I tried to jump back, but my foot slipped, and I dropped. I dropped to my knees. I knew then I was trapped. With a terrifying scream, he sprang right at me. I never saw my dogs when they'd gotten bit between that lion and me, but all of a sudden, there they was. Side by side, they rose up from the ground as one, and they sailed stride into the jaws of death, their small red bodies taking the ripping, slashing claws that were meant for me. I screamed and I charged back into that fight, swinging my axe, but I was careful not to hit my dogs. The battle raged on, and down the side of that mountain, over huckleberry bushes, fallen logs, and rocks we went. It was a rolling, tumbling mass of fight and fury. I was in the middle of it all, falling, screaming, crying, hacking away at every opportunity I had. I had cut that big cat several times. I knew it. Blood showed red on the bit of my axe, but as yet I had not gotten in a fatal lick. I knew it had to be soon, for my dogs was no match against the razor-sharp claws and the long yellow fangs. The screams of that big cat and the deep bellowing voices of my dogs echoed through the mountains as if something terrible was after him and had turned loose. Down the side of the mountain, the terrible fight went on down to the very bottom of that canyon. The big cat had old Dan by the throat. I knew he was seeking to cut that all-important vein, that jugular vein, at the pitiful ball of old Dan. Little Ann, throwing caution, the wind ran in and sank her teeth into that lion's tough neck. With her claws digging into the mountain soil, she braced herself and started a-pulling. The muscles of her small legs knotted and they quivered. She was trying hard to pull that cat's fangs from the throat of old Dan. In the rays of a bright Ozark moon, I could see clearly, and for an instant I saw the broad back of that big cat. I saw the knotty bulge of steel-bound muscle and that piston-like jerk of the deadly hind claws, and trying for that downward stroke that could disembowel my dog. Raising the axe high over my head, I brought it down with all the strength of my body. My aim was true. Behind the shoulders and the broad, muscular back, that heavy blade sank with a sickening sound, and that keen edge cleaved through that tough skin. It seemed to hiss as it sliced its way through bone and gristle. I left the axe where it was, sunk into the eye of the back of that cat. He loosened his hold on the throat of old Dan, and with a scream of pain, he reared up on his hind legs and started pawing the air. Little Ann was dangling from his neck, still holding on with all she had. Her eyes was shut tight, and her small feet was digging and clawing at that body. Old Dan, spewing blood from a dozen wounds, leaped high into the air, and his long red body sailed in between the outspread paws of that lion. I heard the snap of his powerful jaws as they closed in on his throat. The big cat screamed again. Blood gurgled and sprayed, and in a bright red mist it rained out over the underbrush and rattled like the sleet on the white oak leaves. In a boxer stance he stood and clawed the air, and his slitted eyes turned green with hate. He seemed to be unaware of the two hounds hanging from his body, and he just kept staring at me. I stood in a trance and stared back at that ghastly scene. The breath of life was slowly leaving that cat. He was dying on his feet but refusing to go down. My axe handle stuck straight out from his back, and blood gushing from that mortal wound glistened in the moonlight. A shudder ran through his body. He tried once again to scream, but nothing happened. It was the end of the trail for the scourge of the mountains. No more would he scream his challenge from the mere rocks to the valley below. The small, harmless calves and the young colts would be safe from his silent stalking. He fell toward me. It seemed that With his last effort, he was still trying to get me. As his heavy body struck the ground, something exploded in my head, and I knew no more. When I came to, I was sitting down. I was silent and still. A bird disturbed by the fight started chirping far up on the side of the mountain. A small winter breeze rustled some dead leaves in the deep canyon, and a cold, crawling chill crept over my body. I looked over at the lion, and my dog was still glued to his lifeless body, and in his dying convulsions, the axe had become dislodged from his wound. It lay there in the moonlight, covered with blood. My numb brain started working again. I thought of another time that axe had been covered with blood, and I don't know why I thought of Reuben Pritchard at that particular time, or why I thought of them words I had often heard. I got to my feet and went over to my dogs. I knew I had to inspect them to see how badly they was hurt. It wasn't too hard to get little Ann to loosen her hold. I examined her body, and she was cut in several places, but nothing that I thought was fatal. The only bad wound she had was on her shoulder, and it was about 9 inches long and down to the bone. She started licking at it immediately. It was different with old Dan, though. Try as I might, he wouldn't turn loose. Maybe he could remember the night of the cave when he was a pup, how that big cat had screamed and how he had bawled back at him. I took hold of his hind legs and tried to pull him loose. It weren't no use, though. He knew that the hold he had was a deadly one, and he weren't going to let go. I tried to tell him it was all over, that the lion was dead, to turn loose, as I wanted to see how badly he was hurt. He couldn't understand and wouldn't even open his eyes for me. He was determined to hold on until that body had turned cold and stiff. With my axe handle, I tried to pry apart his locked jaws. Holding on to his collar, I led him off to one side. I couldn't turn him loose, as if I knew if I did, he'd head back to that lion again. With one hand, I started examining him. I ran my fingers through the short red hair, and I could feel the quivering muscle of his hot, sweaty skin. He was a bloody mess. His long velvet ears was just shredded. His entire body was a mass of deep, raw red wounds, and on both sides of his rib cage, the sharp claws had laid him open to the bone. His friendly old face was pitiful to see. His razor-sharp claw had ripped down on one angle across his right eye, and his right eye was swollen and shut. I wondered if he'd ever see from that eye again. Boys and girls, that's where we're going to stop. Pretty intense.